So, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So, I work and live in Paris, and I have interactions in connection with the group of here in Charles and so we work together. And there is a sort of group of people that try to develop at the edge between philosophy and theoretical biology what we now call a sort of organizational perspective for biology, which is a highly collaborative enterprise, and I'm very proud to be part of this work. And I should mention that one of the edges of this network is the group of philosophy biology in San Sebastian in Spain, which I was postdoc there a few years ago before moving back to Paris. So this is a sort of my perspective on a collaborative work, which I found very interesting. So indeed I will elaborate on Andrea's talk, and my central message today is to try to convince you, I don't know if you are philosopher, biologist, physicist, whatever, this idea that I will make a connection between three concepts: organization, teleology, and functions. And my claim would be that to convince you that if you want to produce relevant biological explanation, then you have to ascribe functions. If you want to ascribe functions, then you have to take seriously the issue of teleology. And if you want to take seriously the issue of teleology in biology, then you have to have a quite good notion of organization. So the three things go together. Another point. So I will be back actually in 2 weeks. I will give a second talk, and my decision was to have a first talk which is rather philosophical, so which is a follow-up of last work on the issue of theology. And I will give in 2 weeks a talk which is more, I would say, more theoretical, more related with current biology, to show you how these ideas will be applied, what the difference that make to adopt this account rather than others in biology. So the two talks are a bit different. The background idea is that my background idea is that the distinctive feature of biological explanation is that this explanation is teleological. Which means that when we produce try to explain why something, why even a biological entity or phenomenon is there, one should appeal to, among other things, to its effects. Explaining why something is there has to appeal to the effects of the activity of the entity. So the effect produced, one of the relevant effects produced by the entity contribute to explain its existence, and that effect is what is called the system philosophy, and then today this final clause is tense. And so the main claim is that there is, when talking about biological explanations, there is concept between a connection between theology, organization, and functionality. The three concepts go together for intrinsic conceptual reasons. So let's begin from one of the three notions we have, organization. So what do we mean by organization in biology? This concept has two main aspects. One is the fact that it refers to a certain kind of complexity. An organized thing is something that is complex in a specific way. And as a first approximation, I would say there are these kind of ideas. First, which have been mentioned earlier in the literature, of course, in biology. One is the fact that organization has some kind of architecture. An organized system, a system which I can reorganize different parts, a sort of composition of structurally different elements which are put together. Those parts are usually heterogeneous, they are different from each other. And at the same time, they are highly integrated. And the two versions, I think, go together. You have integration of different things. If you have all the parts of the system look the same, there's no need of integration. And a strong emphasis on the importance of relations and hierarchies, levels and hierarchies in the entities. So this first aspect. And the second is what I tend to call self-determination. Organized systems are entities that exist insofar as they contribute, they do something to maintain their condition of existence. Doesn't mean they are independent entities that do not need interaction with the environment, of course, but in an important, irreducible sense, they do something to maintain themselves. And that part is inalienable. We must account for that part. And of course, this implies a sort of circularity between activity and existence, which is good. It's strange if we stick on the classical scientific conception of causality, which goes for cause effect and not the other way around. That's why there's some suspicion about the fact that this kind of circularity should be scientifically relevant. And that's why I'm convinced that it is relevant. So with these two aspects. There is a first theoretical question about this idea of organization, which implies, as I said, some kind of circularity. There is some literature on biological circularity. You certainly know the idea of autopoiesis from Maturana and Varela. There are others, authors. I will talk more about that in 2 weeks. For instance, Robert Rosen or Stuart Kaufman. And so there are a lot of us which talk about circularity. I think that most of them tend to underdetermine, to underspecify what kind of circularities is that work in biological systems and which is specifically different from what may happen in physics or in chemistry or computational computer science. Because of course one of the objections could be, yes, but circularity is not enough. There are many kinds of systems which are not biological systems, which can be described as arising some sort of cycles. So we need to know more about what we mean by circular relation with activity and existence in biology. The move here is to say that we have to locate organization, to define organization at the relevant level of description by appealing to the relevant entities. What kind of entity is related in a circular way in biology? The idea is that to make a distinction between two objects and two regimes, which are simultaneously realized in a biological system. There is, of course, thermodynamics, so biological systems are open thermodynamic systems. And there is a sort of regime of processes, the processes or reactions going on all the time. And a regime of constraints, which was mentioned by Andrea, which are exerted on the processes. And there is a complex relation between the processes and the constraints within the biological system. The claim is that organization is about constraints, not processes. What is organized in biological system are the constraints, not the processes. That's the. So we have to look at the relevant object and their relations to the constraints to understand what organization means. So I'm giving some details, not all the details. I will go back to this in my next talk. But the important distinction between processes and constraints. On the one hand, we have, you take an organism or something. If you look at what happens in a biological system, an organism, a plant, you have, on the one hand, processes, which are defined as any kind of physical-chemical changes, including reactions, chemical reactions, that involve the alteration, consumption, or production of an entity. You have something at the beginning, and this entity, this input of the reaction process, is changes, modified, altered by the reaction of the process, and you get something else at the end. On the other hand, we have constraints. There are other kind of entities system which exert some kind of action on the processes, but can be said to remain unaffected in some sort of conservation at a given time scale. Of course, at the given time scale. For instance, take the example of an enzyme. So, all biological reactions are constrained by enzymes. And how we make the difference between an enzyme and the reactant of a reaction, but it's the fact that the enzyme modifies the reaction, for instance, because it accelerates the reaction, but at the end, it is not consumed by the reaction. You get your enzyme at the end, while the reactants are consumed by the reaction. So there's a difference between all of them. If you have this simple schematic idea of a reaction, there are constraints which exert on a reaction. So this is the effect, and you can ask why B. You can say because A, or because C, and because C. But because this by hypothesis is concerned, you have a conceptual distinction between two kinds of causes of the reaction, the constraints and the material. Robert Rosen would have said the material cause of the reaction. Some people, Robert Rosen's distinction was between efficient and material causes. I don't know, it's a difficult discussion, but to make the distinction between these two conceptually different kind of causes. And of course, this applies not only to enzymes, but to any kind of structure that, because of its geometry and configuration, is able to canalize processes and reactions while displaying some kind of conservation. For instance, the vascular system exerts a microscopic constraint on the flow of blood, of course. For instance, explains if I want to understand why a given molecule of oxygen is moved from one position to another position. This is made because the topological configuration of the vascular system, which is locally conserved, is not changed. It is precisely because this property doesn't change. It's explaining why it can canalize the molecule from one point to another. So you have constraints all over the place in biological systems. Now, the move consists in saying that so biological constraints act on processes and adopt a specific behavior, which is the biological relevant behavior, because of this constraint. Otherwise, the behavior would be extremely unlikely or even impossible. It's because of the fact that one molecule of oxygen goes precisely to that position is explicable only because a constraint or a number of constraints are exerted by the biological systems. Otherwise, it would be impossible. What happens in biological systems is that the processes, that is the conceptual move, is the processes canalized by the constraints play a role in regenerating and maintaining the constraints themselves. So the important effect of the constraints is that they set the conditions so as to maintain and regenerate, nourishing and repairing those very constraints. As a result, the constraints, the whole set of constraints in the system depend on each other for their existence and maintenance over time. So, for instance, you have the vascular system, which, among other things, canalize food and oxygen for its own cells, which are maintained because of the whole physiological cooperation between parts. So the constraint exists because they canalize the processes so as to maintain their own conditions. The term closure, which is, I don't know why, I have some ideas, is the technical term, which from Piaget actually is used to designate this mutual dependence between the constraints. So I don't give this the meaning of this term, but the idea is that closure means mutual dependence. So given this relation between the constraint and system, you have closure, which is the fact that it's collectives that make sense. The result is saying that from the intuitive notion of organization, the first claim that we advocate is the idea that we should understand organization in a technical sense, which is the fact that there are closure constraints, and these closure constraints which realizes self-determination as self-constraints. So if you want to understand self-determination, we have to interpret as term of self-constraint, which in logical systems take the form of a closure of constraints. So this is quite difficult relation between the terms. So I'm not really going to give an example actually, but I'll leave it for the next talk. But the intuitive idea is that if you want to understand how some entities in the system, vascular system, the intestine, or enzymes which are produced from here, we have a sort of multicellular system. And within the multicellular system, we have the small intestine. And then within the small intestine, we have a single cell. And this illustration is supposed to show that at different level of description, we have several entities which canalize the flows. So here we have the flow, representing the flow of food, which is decomposed, absorbed, and distributed to all the part of the system, showing that all of these entities exert a constraint on the flow, and this is part of the explanation of why the flow takes a different form, goes in all the cells, and then, because of the closure, retroact on the condition of existence of the constrained cells. So all of the entities actually has active constraints, and at the same time are the target of the arrow, which shows that they are nourished and maintained by the system. So all the systems are at the same time causes for something and effects for something else at the same time. And if you extract this from the system, put that aside, of course the condition of existence will be either reduced, your vascular system will degrade in a short time, it will disappear. So its maintenance over time, for a human, for 80 or 100 years, depends on the fact that it is included in a system in which it contributes to maintain a sort of flow, useful flow. So I'm not discussing this illustration today, but just give you an intuition. So that's organization. This understanding of organization heavily relies on Stuart Kaplan's work on work constraint cycles and Robert Rosen understanding of organization. Now let's move to the simple term, teleology, in connection with Andreas Durkheim's most important here. Given the characterization that I have suggested, my second claim is that organizational closure is a purposive regime, because the effect of his activity can be legitimately understood as a cause of his existence because of this brutal dependence. So, some of the effects of the activity of the system, of one of these parts, actually contribute to explain why the system keeps existing. So in essence, we want to understand why we have this system. Part of the answer is because it does this and this. So we are creating a cycle between acting, doing something, producing effects, and existing in the sense of keep existing, the ongoing maintenance over time. And it is realizing closure, then it can be the object of teleological explanation. So just a terminological, the adjective there's a sort of ambiguity in my mind between purposiveness and teleology. So teleology then should be used to refer to an explanation about which involves final causes, chaos. And purposiveness is the characteristic of the system which can make the object of the logical explanation. So I'm sometimes mixing up the two terms, but its use is distinct. Of course, I'm not repeating because this is what Maria was explaining. You must think this necessary interpretation of the area of Kant, according to which we must think that the system as it were both cause and effect of itself. So this theoretical construction that I have rapidly shown to you is supposed to be a way of having a scientifically legitimate understanding of the teleological principle. How could we make sense or to use the idea that a system is cause and effect of itself? And then, one important point is that this organization realizes a specific kind of purposiveness, which is intrinsic, which means that the final cause, the so-called final cause, the telos, is one and the same thing that the condition of existence of the system. So what the system is aiming at is its own maintenance, nothing more than its own maintenance. There's no external determination of what the whole system is. And this is a very complex story, but I said something about that. The suspicions about teleology in contemporary biology also depends on the fact that when you talk about teleology to biologists, they tend to think to external teleology. They tend to, if I say that I think that theology is important, they can interpret my sentence as if I were imagining that biological systems are such and such because of a divine intention. And that is extrinsic theology. But there is another tradition, which goes back to Aristotle actually, which makes a distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic teleology. And my claim is that we cannot make biology if we do not have a clear understanding of intrinsic teleology, which goes with the notion of organization. So this sort of historical, socio-historical point that I'm not discussing too much here, but it's very important. And of course, there was a weekly debate the fact that Darwin accounts are an answer to Halley and so on and so on. But just keep in mind that this difference between intrinsic and extrinsic theology for philosophical reasons and then for scientific reasons. Okay, so let's suppose that you agree with me and say, okay, good. Theoretically speaking, this notion of organization provides a specific understanding of circularity. Not any form of circularity is relevant in biology, but in this specific form of closure constraints. But then, so it means that if you agree with me, it means that you recognize that there is a difference between a system like that
então você passou por isso? Não, tem cor aqui. Jackson também tem cor. Não, tentativa.
And something like that.
Só não tá preto.
So this is a very abstract illustration of two kinds of regimes. This is organized systems in which you have processes which are canalized by constraints, and the effect of the process is to produce one of the constraints. So the constraints, we have processes, and the constraints which are represented by this double. And then in this system, there is a circular relation, because the constraints depend on each other, which includes the constraints, which are maintained by the system. And this is different from this, in which we have a cycle of processes, which depend on each other, and this cycle is constrained by, it's canalized by a set of constraints, which are external to the cycle. The cycle does not maintain or produce the constraints. The water cycle, so let's take the example of physical cycle as a water cycle. To a first approximation, the idea is that this is a representation of the water cycle. The cycle is a system in which the water takes different is a set of transformations. The water takes different forms under the control of a set of constraints: the temperature, the sun, the slope, and many other things, which canalize the process. But what is circular is the relation between the processes, and the constraints are external. In this case, the constraints are internal. So this is a sort of understanding of the formative force, Kant's formative force, which explains why the system produces its own constraints. So this is the result of the theoretical part. Then a philosopher could come and say, yes, good, okay, but why should we say that this is purposive and not this? Even if I agree that there is a difference, you can say, yes, but this self-maintains. The effects of the activity contribute to explain the maintenance, as in this case, in a different way. But why should not we say that this is teleological? If there is a circularity, it's a different kind of circularity. But so we could say that this exists because it does something, as in the other case. And this is a philosophical issue. And of course, as you will see, if we are unable to say that there is a difference here, then the consequence would be that, as in this case, this system has functions, because functions are related to theology, as we will see. So the question is, why should not ascribe functions to a water cycle? The function of the river is to produce the sea, and the sea has a function to produce the clouds and so on. Why what prevent us to do that? And then this is the more technical point. This is an argument that we try to develop in a very simple paper. The idea is that if we focus on the condition of existence, what makes this entity exist? The condition of existence of the water cycle, of any kind of cycle, are to be met independently from the causal action that the cycle possibly exerts on its own boundary conditions. The water cycle would exist even though the river did not modulate its own bed. As you know, in the case of the river, the water cycle, the different parts of the system do interact with the constraints. For instance, the river dig the bed, so modify the constraints. But the idea is that this is not part of the explanation of why the water cycle exists. Even though the cycle would not interfere with the constraints, it would exist. If you have the constraints and you put water, then you have the cycle. So the cycle do not prepare or maintain its existence. Intrinsic purposiveness do not, that's the point, do not merely point to the relation of a circular relation with viscosity effects. So not any kind of circularity is relevant for philosophical reasons, but rather to the situation in which the activity of a system, by producing some effect, contribute to specify, to determine the conditions at which the circulation as such can occur. So if in this case the process would not generate the constraints, simply the system would not exist. In this case, it would exist in any case. So the conclusion is, by obeying external constraints, the dynamics of physical cycles, for instance, I'm just taking one example of a cycle which can exist in nature, do not specify themselves to the extent that they simply take place. They occur. If some conditions, initial conditions, boundary conditions are met, then you get your cycle. Cycles self-maintain but do not self-determine. Therefore, they are not purposive regime. That's why we do not even have the intuition of ascribe functions to the water cycle. And the intuition could be made more explicit if you imagine a situation in which instead of having a natural water cycle, you build an artificial water cycle. So you build your constraints, you build a system, an artificial system, and then you put water, and you conceive a system in which water, I just take some kind of illustration of a system in which water change is transformed through the cycle and create by the system and create a cycle. So you have an artificial water cycle, but of course here intuition I think helps us because you don't think for a second that this system is self-determined determining itself. It's just completely determined by external boundary conditions. So, and just if you put water, then you decide. So the intuition, yeah, I think that the intuition adds into a construction is that you see why I think in this case we have no teleology enough. The effects of the activity of the system do not contribute to explain its existence, which is completely externally determined. And then, so this is the second move. We need a technical sense, a theoretical sense of organization in biology. Second move, this goes with a sense of teleology, which is specific to the fact that circularity is in the form of self-constraint. Third move, what about functions? The concept of function, Andreas said already a few words about this, is, in my view, closely related to the question of subordination in biology. And in biology, I mean biology in a very large sense. I mean all domains in which biological systems do something. So not just for understanding individual biological systems, but also the interactions, as in ecological systems, even in social systems. As soon as you have biological systems that are there and cooperate, functional descriptions seems to make be relevant. And of course, it's because I think in all those cases the organization is relevant. I would say more. Distinctive explanation in this domain consists in ascribing functions. If you are unable to ascribe function in cellular biology, multicellular biology, ecology, social science, if you are able to ascribe functions, you are not providing relevant biological explanations. You are maybe providing physical explanations, chemical explanations. One example is, as you know, systems biology is growing very fast these days, and there are a lot of data about, for instance, many things. For instance, about proteins. So we have a good understanding of all the interaction organisms can have with other proteins. And they can also have a good explanation of how this protein is synthesized by the system and how it is produced. In many cases, however, they do not have a clue about the function. And of course, this aspect is a problem from the biology. If I can know a lot of things about this protein, how it is produced and so on, but if I'm unable to ascribe a function, my explanation is lacking something. Something is lacking there. So, and there's papers which say that there are a lot of things that we know, but given that we are unable to explain functions, we don't know. We are not doing biology, we are doing chemistry, which is perfectly legitimate, but if you are trying to understand what these parts do in the system, then you have to explain functions. And then, of course, we have a definition of functions for you. In this framework, you can get a definition of a function, as a logical function, which are, of course, one and the same thing that the constraints. The effects of the constraints, which are subject to closure, exert what biologists call functions. So, for instance, you say, what is the function of the heart? The function of the heart is to pump blood, and not to making a noise. Why? Because, according to our current knowledge, the effect of pumping blood is an effect which canalizes a lot of processes, which in the end result in the maintenance of the whole organism and of the heart itself. So if you want to understand why the hearts keep existing in this organism, I have to appeal to the fact that it pumps blood, not other things. Because it's because I'm recognizing that the heart is subject to organizational closure. That is why we ascribe a function. And so the functions are the different contributions to the intrinsically teleological organization whose existence explains the existence of the functional trait itself. So this is because the whole system keeps existing that we explain why that part is there. It's an irreducible part of the explanation of why we have this kind of objects as enzymes, vascular systems, membranes in a system. That's because they include in this kind of system, this kind of notion has carry on a sense of differentiation. You need different, so the various concepts must be different because they need each other with maintenance, and of course with integration. They must cooperate so as to maintain the system. So the notion of a function implies the two aspects. And in the debate, in the contemporary debate about the functions, almost all authors claim that functional descriptions are supposed to possess a teleological and normative dimension. If you are giving a good definition of a biological function, it's because we are able to explain in what sense they are teleological and in what sense they are normative. So let me enter into this by relying on what I've been saying now. Andrea has already mentioned this distinction. I'm using it for a specific reason. There are two kinds of teleology because I need it now to account for the notion of function. You can have intrinsic purposiveness, which is the fact that if you want to describe the singular relation between existence and activity, then if the relation is intrinsic, then you are able to do that within the constituent entity of system. The telos is identical to the condition of existence. For instance, here I am able to show how the system runs a circular relation which maintains itself. So I will explain why the activity produces an effect which is part of the explanation of the ideal system in which this circular relation can be described. For instance, of course, an organized system. Then we can have an extrinsic theory in which each of the opposite of the other, that the circular relation between existing and activity takes place beyond the boundary of the considered entity. Telos is distinct from the condition of existence, although related. An example from an artifact, a knife. A knife is an artifact. Usually we assign functions to artifacts, which means, given that a function is teleological claims, means that if you want to explain why there are knives, the explanation has to appeal to its effects, because it can cut bread, for instance, or meat. So the explanation is teleological. But if you just look at the knife and you connect this with the fact of cutting bread, so why cutting bread is supposed to explain its existence? To understand that, you have to integrate this in a larger system, which is, let's say, a social technical organization, in which we know that there are people that produce knives because they need things that cut bread. So there is a teleological, if you just look at the knife, you say, yes, the explanation is teleological. We are not satisfied if we are unable to produce a scatter function, so to explain the existence through the activity. But the teleological relation is extrinsic. We have to appeal to a higher level organization to fully understand the circular relation. Why cutting bread explains existence? That's the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic. And my claim is that, and this third important claim, is that when we assign functions to parts of organism or biological system in general, we are saying that those parts realize extrinsic purposiveness, and functional description deal with extrinsic teleology. Just as for artifacts, if you wanted to, when you say the function of the artifact is to pump blood, to understand why pumping blood explains the existence of the art, you have to go beyond the heart and locate the art within the organized system, the organism, which realizes closure, the circular relation between the constraints. So in a sense, functions depend, the logic of functions depend on the fact that you are implicitly locating the system in organization. So extrinsic teleology is connected but distinct from intrinsic teleology, and it depends. I would say that it would not be functions if there were no organizations. But any time you ascribe a function to something, you are locating this entity in an organized system, which explains the cycle between acting and existing. So that's the way in which I would say why functional description are teleological. And of course, my take-home message is that if you think that biology must describe functions to explain, then you are forced to accept, at the very least, to deal with issues about teleology, organization, and so on. Otherwise, you do not have a well-grounded notion of function. I'm not detailing this, but it's important to mention it. I think that purposiveness, intrinsic purposiveness, grounds norms. You know that part of the problem of philosophical in biology is the issue of norms, values, and so on. But it's a very complex issue. So just mentioning one point. To get intrinsic norms, you need purposiveness, you need terms. The fact that purposive entities are supposed to behave in a given way to produce specific effects. When you have this kind of systems, then you can say, this one must do that, otherwise it would cease to exist or disappear. When biologists use this kind of normative, at least use the kind of normative language, what they are saying is that they are, again, understanding what this guy does in the context of the system. And that's why I say he's supposed to do that, otherwise it would disappear. It makes a difference, doing that or that, differently from physical systems which just have effects. Doing that rather than that makes a difference from the system, because if it doesn't produce the right effect, then the whole system collapses and then it disappears. So it makes a difference. That's why we can say there's a normative dimension. And more technically, the Velhos, so relevant effects, generates the criterion for determining what norms the system is supposed to follow. In a naturalized way, because of course I'm not adding anything, I'm just treating some effects as norms. So I'm reducing some norms to some effects in a perfectly scientific way. This is also, of course, is just part of the story, because norms is a much more complex issue, and of course, when philosophers of biology discuss about norms, they tend to think about dysfunction. Actually, the debate is about doing well or being ill or sickness, because this is another aspect of the story. I'm not reading into it because it's not long. But I do want to say that at least the first level of normativity is generated by the fact of taking seriously the issue of teleology and organization in biology. We can start saying things about norms, even though the issue is very complex. Now, this is something that I would like to say because it allows locating what I'm saying in the debate. I don't know if you know this debate about functions in biology. The philosophical debate is a huge debate. One of the even incredible. There's so many papers about functions in biology. And one of the central notions is etiology. And I was mentioning etiological theories of function and those kind of things. So what I would like to do is connecting the notion that I've been discussing with this one. Etiology means study of causes, the origins. Aitia are causes in Greek, so it's simply study of causes. Now, I would like to say that insofar as teleology is the study about final causes, it follows the teleological explanation are, by definition, a kind of etiology. Just a specific kind of etiology which appeals to final causes. So, all theological explanations are etiological. Although, of course, not all theological explanations are teleological. There are physical systems that can be explained without appealing to final causes because there is no relevant circularity. It not work. Actually, the question whether functional or archaeological is the main divide in the recent philosophical debate about biological functions. The fight is between those who think that when biologists ascribe functions, they are providing a logical explanation. And the others that think that no, they do not. Well, that's just to know, all the debate seems to come from a pioneering paper by Larry Wright about what is function in 1976. So he gave this definition. Anytime you ascribe a function, you are reasoning like this, which is, of course, exactly what I was mentioning about circular relation between effects. And the debate tries that if you want to give a good philosophical understanding of function, then we have to try to naturalize this, so provide an interpretation of this which is not absurd. Because, of course, one of the risks is that you are simply reversing the order between cause and effects in time. It doesn't make sense. So in what cases this makes sense? And, of course, the account of functions that I provided tries to interpret this in a naturalized way. But as Andrea was mentioning, the mainstream interpretation of right cycle is the etiological accounts, or more precisely selected effect theories. I'm not repeating what he just explained, but the point is that the existence of a trait type is explained by clinical effects covered by natural selection and logical functional adaptations. So we are explaining, if we say the functional adaptations, then we are explaining the existence by the effects, but by the effects of previous instances of the same trait that explains its current existence. So it is an evolutionary interpretation of the loop between causes and effects, which seems to be the only possible way of providing an acceptable loop. What's the problem? This is just this point that's interesting me. If you understand functions biology only in evolutionary terms, then you fall into what could be called epiphenomenalism. The fact that functions are grounded on past selected history, not about the current activity of the entity. You are not looking at what happens in your system. You are making an hypothesis on its selective history. You say the function of the heart is to pump blood because previous hearts were selected because they produce less effect. You are not looking at what happens right now. And your current heart could also not be pumping blood. But the function would be to pump blood because this is what your selective history by hypothesis tells you. So it is this way the philosophical problem of evolutionary definition of function is that they do not talk about the phenomenon, what you are looking at. They are hypotheses on the history of the trait. And of course, there's a lot of debate on it because this looks like a big weakness. Because when a physiologist or a cellular biologist ascribe a function to an entity, is not all the time making hypotheses about the history. He just tries to understand what this trait does right now in this system, what is utility in the system. So I take this as a very huge problem because it does not deal with current systems. And of course there is an answer to that. The other half of the literature takes a very different approach, but you can notice it's very analytic. Analytical philosophy. The point is that, okay, of course we need a definition of function that deals with what the entity does right now. So simply systemic accounts define functions as contribution of an entity to a capacity, to a relevant or interesting capacity in the system. Nothing more. And there is also interpretation in terms of mechanistic accounts to them with more functions. So the point is that these accounts remove the definition do not account for the existence of the functional here. So when we say the function of the protein is to do this, do this, that's because we have decided that the effect is relevant for us. We are scientists, we are looking for something, we are discussing something. That's simple. The function of the identity is to contribute to my target capacity that I'm studying. Point. And this has nothing to do with understanding why the protein is there or why the trait is there. It's much more local. So what they do is that they completely remove the teleological normative dimensions. They just reduce functions to some kind of causal relation, which is interesting for the observer. That's all. And of course, if you take that path, the weakness is the under-specification, because the choice of the target capacity depends on the observer interest. Anything could be a function. Absolutely anything. There is no distinction within the system. No conceptual distinction to the relevant association. The objection is all the time made to this kind of account. Yes, of course, this is necessarily true, because you are just understanding functions as causal relations. Probably functions are causal relations. And all the debate, even the historical debate about function, teleology, organization, is completely clean, and you get a very vague, in my view, definition. That's why we think that what we say, in a way, try to integrate, to provide a further alternative to this debate between the two mainstream accounts. Because the organizational account is both etiological and systemic. It's etiological because it's teleological. So if you really read that teleology is etiology, then it's clearly etiological. You want to explain why something is there, in the sense of why something keeps existing. But the difference is that the neural loop is described within the organization of each individual logical system, allows a scaling function for organizational reasons. Okay, the upshot is that those terms go together. If you think that this is important, then you think this is important, then you think this is important. Then it was I'm almost done. Just okay, so this doesn't matter, so we understood. I, in 2 minutes, would like to say a word about the boundaries, the domain of application of those ideas. Of course, you can take the typical organisms, multicellular organisms like me, are organized entities. But the idea is that this definition is not supposed to be restricted to multicellular organisms, not even to organisms, actually, but to a larger class of biological systems, actually, systems which are biological, but not necessarily organisms. And there are two possible candidates. One are, of course, ecosystems, and the work has been done here and is being done by my PhD students on the application of the organizational principles to the upper level of description, which are ecosystems, which could be understood as organized system, and then biological system and functional system in the same way. In the case of functions to biotic and abiotic items of biodiversity that we describe the organized system. And of course, also, it could be done with social systems. Precisely, we want to say and treat, for instance, artifacts as organs in this kind of social systems. So social systems are organized, and then we can ascribe function to the items for the same reasons. In both cases, my attitude is to be cautious, because of course it might be the case that organizational principle can be applied to different level descriptions, but if you change the level description, then something could change in your concepts. And I am a strict anti-reduction, so this idea could apply, but with modification, because this is not the same level of description, and so maybe concept should change. the way in which constraints are organized will change and so on. But there is a way in which we can try to produce a general framework to understand organization on different levels. And I think that you are tired, so I'm not sure that I'm discussing this today. There are, of course, objections, possibilities. Well, but maybe there is a sense in which theology could apply beyond biological systems in physics. And one of the candidates are distributed systems. Not discussing why, because the idea is that, so according to some authors, you can explain these systems by saying that they self-constrain. They produce a general constraint, and these constraints somehow stabilize the condition of existence of the end. So the system is a self-constraining system, then would be a self-dynamic system, and so it's a teleological system, and so on. So this discussion for philosophers, mostly. Although this would have implication of understanding of this kind of phenomenon. I would simply say that I'm not, if someone would prove me that a flame is a self-constraining system, yes, doesn't seem to be a big problem to me. Yeah, maybe nature is continuous, so the boundaries are somehow loose. I would say that in that case, statistical systems realize intrinsic teleology. But of course, that's all, because they are clearly not so complex to be scattered organized systems, at best in one constraint, this structure. So, in particular, if they are not closed, they pass to do not have functions. So, yes, why not? As I put in one paper, except the structure and closed organization would have almost nothing in common with respect to the color regimes, except the very fact of being both intrinsically and teleological by hypothesis. So boundaries could be not completely separated, but this is open to, I would say, even open to theoretical investigation, because it's unclear whether or not these structures are self-constraining systems. So I really don't know. So that's all. I have tried to convince you that biological organization requires self-determination. As set in a specific, those things should be understood in a specific sense, self-constraint, which biological system take a more specific form, closure of constraints, organization. If so, then biological organization realizes intrinsic purposiveness, and this is open to biological explanation, can be the object of biological explanation. Constraints, the parts of this organization realize extrinsic purposiveness and they exert biological function. Ascribing function means claiming that those systems are extrinsic purposive within an organization. And the organizational account provides original integration of selective and systemic accounts within the organizational system. So try to integrate intuitions of those traditions. An approach could be applied to a wide range of biological systems beyond the case of typical organisms, at least much of this is ongoing work. Thanks. And back to beyond the people who are here, other collaborators which have been working last years. Thanks.
So let's move to discussion. I will help coordinate and ask you, Andrea,